side-on view of the front porch of the National Gallery in Edinburgh, I thought was a great subject for one of our 10-minute daily drawing exercises. Now, I did draw this for a very, very early YouTube drawing video, so I thought it would be fun for me to have another go trying to capture it with a very different drawing style for part of these 15-minute drawing exercises daily. Now, with these Doric columns, the thing about Doric columns is they are not equally wide all the way down. They get wider towards the base, and they actually do it even with a slight bulge, not with a straight line. So that makes them challenging to draw if we want to be that true to what we're looking at. And also, they're fluting the grooves that we have around the face of the cylinder of the drum of the columns is quite visually prominent in their overall effect at this distance, certainly. And so I want to do some sort of rough estimation of those. That's not going to be so precise that it makes it 3 times as long to draw, but that equally convey the effect without looking too messy. So that's my aim, and that will be somewhat towards the end. Now you can see I start with this column to the left because it's actually the closest column to me, so it's the least distorted by perspective by moving away. I'm not completely square onto this. The portico is moving away from me as it moves from left to right slightly, which does have a slight effect on perspective and foreshortening. So that's something that's important to bear in mind. These pads, these flat square pads that sit on top of the Doric capitals, it's important to pay attention where their corners are, because by corner I mean the end, because where the end is in relation to the actual column underneath totally depends on the angle that we're looking at it from. If we're looking straight on, then the corners of that square pad will overhang equally on each side of the Doric capital. But once we start to look side on at these, then the corner, the right-hand corner, slides further and further overhanging the drum of the column. So it's an important point to notice and to try and take into account. And I probably notice it more because I know it's there and therefore I know to look for it, than that I actually observe that level of detail automatically. I know it's a bit of a trouble spot for me because my critiquing of past drawings has told me that, shown me that. So therefore I can be alert for it and look out for it. This is the advantage of critiquing, and it's just as important that we critique these daily drawings. In fact, it might be good though to critique them later in the day. If we do them in the morning, critique them in the afternoon with a cup of coffee or something. Partly we might be less defensive, but also we get a fresh take. We want to be the teacher, not the student, when we critique. So we don't want to be distracted by what the student knows and understands and thinks they've seen. So I've been moving across by looking at what's between the columns as much as the gap between the columns and trying to work out, can I accommodate that in this space? And with the actual outer edges of the columns, because I suppose I'm not overly used to drawing columns that aren't basically straight up and down on each side, I've flared out probably too wide. So when I do the shading, I can actually adjust the columns because I can come in on one side down the base just to narrow the width to change the overall proportions and overall shape effect. Or equally, I can bring the shading on a different side, not quite up to the column, to make it appear slightly wider. So these are all the points where later on in a scene such as this, we can, what I think of as massage our first take and just nudge it more effectively. So it looks more like what we see in our reference. So now I'm doing the entablature. That's this horizontal section that sits on top of the columns. There's a plain section which sometimes just has some thin banding on it, and then we have a section with the triglyphs. That's what I'm drawing now. That's what they're called, a symbolic representation of when timber ends were sticking out here in Greek buildings before they built them in stone. Now, before I began to draw these, I paid attention to the reference and noted that there is one that sits above each column and one that sits on each end, and then there's one that fills the gap between those. And so if we see it, we can do it. It also confirms whether our columns are accurately enough spaced. And now I'm drawing by negative space here, just that little bit of detail on this banding under the triglyphs, where there are some little knobbly bits casting shadows and so forth. But I drew the shadows. I didn't try and draw the objects. And now there's this section on top. I'm not going to probably do justice to this top section. This is going to be a pretty gestural drawing. I did basically outline the portico, and I hadn't, and the foreground. I hadn't started the shading basically, or barely had started the shading for further back in the porch area until the 10 minutes was up. So we'll do that double time, but there'll be just a bit less of double time today, I think. And now we've got these bobbles on top, and I thought I don't have time to try and line them up. So I just did them by sight, but at the end I counted to see how accurate was I. Did I make a good fist of it? And there's 8, and I have 8. The only difference is that my extreme left one isn't perhaps as hard up against the edge as it could be. And this is actually, I think, the very base of a large statue of Queen Victoria, but I decided not to worry about that. Instead, I think I better come back down now and pay some attention to the foreground, because this is where foregrounds in streetscapes start to show their tricky side, where you get multiple things in front of each other at various depths of plane. So we've got this flower box in the front, we've got some people behind it at various levels, we've got people sitting on the steps of the gallery. And so trying to work out where not to draw lines when I'm still doing the basic outlines is one thing. And then remembering to do it's the first thing. Then doing it accurately enough, and then being able to take advantage of that by drawing those foreground subjects in. And this is the sort of place where if I haven't lined up the gap in my drawing, I'll shift the subject, the foreground object, if I can. And if you like, keep the visual integrity of my line work. So here I am. I'm not going to add all the figures that are in this. A 10-minute sketch. Simplifying it is important. I think it's important, though, to try and add some figures, partly because if we draw this sort of scene, we need practice at putting the people into it. We need practice at making them look human from the scale and distance and style that we're drawing with. And we also need to scale them correctly to the objects around them. So they have to not look human, but all look about the same size, unless they're children. Can be good to sometimes put children in just to capture that sense of drawing figures at different scales. But it's certainly something we should include when they come up in these drawing exercises. And also being able to scatter them at different depths in our scene, and not so much the case in this one, but where there's room in the foreground or distance to put figures greatly apart, because that, again, is something we can practice. And it also often is a way of checking whether the overall scale of the rest of our scene, the objects, the buildings around the figures, is accurate, because it should always look as though a figure, if they were to walk up in the closest way to a nearby building, wouldn't look too large or too small. It's a pretty common scale problem with buildings, that there are people in the street who would actually be 8 foot tall or 10 foot tall or 3 foot tall compared to the building that's next to them. So it's one of the challenges of doing streetscapes, where we have two fairly well recognizable objects, a street shop and a person, to understand what size they should be in relation to each other. And then as they both move backwards along the street, we have to keep them in balance with each other, as well as the overall visual appearance. So we've flicked into double time now, I think, just. So it was just a bit more than 10 minutes. Now I'm doing a pretty bodgy job on the flutes, and I don't know why I did this, change my hand direction, because it was a lot less accurate than this, which is what I had been doing and I went back to doing straight away. So I've learned something in this. If I were doing a more considered drawing of this scene, if I was doing a more considered drawing of this scene, I would have moved the lamp that was in the way, and I would have probably sat on the end of the table to draw horizontal lines, because generally I can draw horizontal lines for longer, more accurately, and space them better horizontally than vertically. I think because vertically we're pulling down towards us, and we start to break as our hand starts to get close to our torso, and that slowing down messes, I think, with the momentum, which is often the foundation or the driving force of good lines: confident, well-placed momentum. So just a few details now around the base of this, pretty close to it being done. I realise I haven't done those round, they would have been, I think, symbolic round oak leaves or something along the top. So that's something for you to do for me. G'day, Stephen Travers here. I hope this was helpful. Please hit the like button if it was, and you'll find this photo, of course, on my channel community page. So why not have a go? But hey, whatever you draw, however you draw it, in whatever time you draw it, however it turns out, make sure you have fun. See you next time. Bye.